Does anybody know what, this is so great. So much better than the laser pointer. So if any of you guys act up, bam.
Yeah.
Does anybody know what bugs work to control this noxious weed? Does anybody know which one this is?
That's not a noxious weed.
All right. So this is on the Mount. Oh, excellent.
You can do that.
So this is on the Mount Haggin Wildlife Management Area over Mill Creek Pass by Anaconda. So the Mount Haggin Wildlife Management Area is over by the big smokestack smelter by Anaconda. You guys are probably familiar with it. And the reason I work there so much is there's a lot of weeds because it was heavily disturbed from the smelter back in the day, and there's a ton of money. So you always, just a little advice once you guys graduate, go where the money is. That's the important thing. They got a lot of money because of the Superfund site. And so there's a lot of reclamation occurring up here. But anyway, if you drive over Mill Creek Pass into the Big Hole drainage, there's a big Camas Prairie. So the Mount Haggin Wildlife Management Area is kind of like a Jekyll and Hyde area, or like Janus, the two-faced god. A part of it is just incredibly beautiful native habitat, including this beautiful Camas Prairie. And then and the reason this is there and isn't so disturbed like a lot of Haggin is it's on the Big Hole side, so the smelter emissions, they swirled around in the upper Clark's Fork, but they didn't make it over the top into the Big Hole divide very readily, not as much of it. So that land stayed in better shape. Plus, the Anaconda Company, they wanted to prove that the smelter emissions that were depositing all of these heavy metals actually weren't bad, wasn't causing these problems, and that these metals weren't dangerous. So they preserved this, what they called the mule ranch, and didn't overgraze it and kept it in beautiful shape. So that's why the Mount Haggin Wildlife Management Area is lucky enough to have this incredibly beautiful spot. But, whoops. So some of the biggest threats to native plants and plant communities in Montana, I mean, you guys could all imagine, parking lots are pretty bad for native plants. Subdivisions aren't the best. But basically, habitat conversion in the agriculture, mining, and now development have probably converted most of the area in Montana that's no longer native habitat is no longer native habitat due to these, and agriculture, of course, is the primary one. So that's conversion. This would be like crops, grazing, then disturbance, which isn't quite the same as conversion anyway, but herbicides, of course, kill broadleaf plants. They're not too discriminating. They could care less if it was a native or non-native plant. Beautiful wildflower, evil foreign invader, they don't care. They kill it all. Broadleaf, so herbicides. And then have other things like exotic species, climate change, that kind of thing. So what you can end up with is an area that looks like this. This is up on Mount Haggin too, but this is on the Clark's Fork side. This is up towards the Continental Divide actually, but you can see that something happened here. I mean, one thing that happened is they cut down all the trees, but really it's not that the trees were cut down, it's that the smelter emissions killed all the plants, all the soil washed away, and you're left with the stuff that's underneath the soil that used to be there, which is just I don't know what you would call that stuff, but basically rock. And this is a volcanic tuff, and it's really hard to restore. It doesn't like to build up. But you can see, so these are the stumps of the trees that were cut down for framing up the mines or to feed the smelters before the big stack started burning coal. But you can see these roots coming out right here. So probably the soil was about up to here probably. You guys have probably heard all this stuff from other lecturers who actually know a hell of a lot more than I do. But anyway, the soil is maybe up to there. So they've lost all the soil. So, and when you lose all the soil, you lose your seed bank. So when this place starts to revegetate on its own, what will grow there is what seeds are there, and it won't be the natives probably because there's no native seed bank. You're just going to end up with weeds. What does that have to do with? Well, anyway, we still haven't gotten to the biocontrol, but Montana has, let's say, around 2,512 species of plants. 83% of these are the ones that grow on their own, that reseed, that are basically native or feral, that are established plants that don't need to be planted by people to survive. 83% of them are considered native, 17% are non-native. So weeds, like in terms of restoration, or for us plant people or biologists, a weed is any exotic plant that interferes with native ecosystems. And actually Montana is pretty progressive compared to other states, because they say that a noxious weed, in order for something to be listed as noxious, at least they were good enough to say that it has to be a non-native exotic plant. It's kind of funny though, they talk about may render land unfit, or that may harm native plant communities, but really this is just this is my bias. I'll just be upfront about it. Really what harms native plant communities is probably agriculture, forestry, and livestock. So it's kind of a funny dichotomy there. You guys are familiar with the noxious weed list. You can go through wherever there's a star, an asterisk, those are plants that have biocontrol insects introduced to control them. Interestingly enough, yellow star thistle is not known to be established in Montana. And there are some botanists, one of whom has spoken here, Matt, who feels that yellow star thistle will never be a problem in Montana because its ecological niche isn't here. This isn't the right kind of habitat for it. It's too cold, whatever. But anyway, the priority two, these are barely established in Montana. Only one of them has biocontrol. But now we have the ones that are widely established that you guys are all familiar with. Everything with asterisks, so thistle, bindweed, spurge, all the knapweeds, they all have biocontrol insects introduced by the federal government that are approved for use by the state and the federal government, by the USDA and the Montana Department of Ag for use in Montana. And then these are a different category, regulated plants. Of course, if you notice on those lists, there's no grasses listed as noxious weeds in Montana, which makes sense because the ag people like grass. Cows eat grass, although cows like wildflowers too. But if you spray, you end up with grass, and cows will eat grass. So of course they're not going to list any grass. But now they're starting to realize that with the common use of, with herbicides being so commonly used in the state, there's starting to be a lot of non-native grasses are starting to become a major problem in the state, including cheatgrass, smooth brome, things like that. Cheatgrass is the only one they're real concerned with yet, but that will change over time.
Cheatgrass isn't still considered noxious, or do you think it will be sometime?
I think they're really reluctant to list a plant. It's just political, and broadleaf herbicides don't kill it. And it, basically, like, what's the old joke by real estate agents? If you're buying property, you tell the realtor, that's cheatgrass. And if you're a realtor selling property, you're like, no, that's downy brome. So biocontrol of noxious weeds with insects. You guys probably all know about biocontrol. You're probably a little freaked out about biocontrol, as you should be. There's horrible horror stories throughout the world of introducing mongoose to Hawaii. Didn't work so well. So in general, biocontrol is introducing organisms to control other organisms. But what we're talking about today is introducing insects to control plants, and more specifically, introducing insects that evolved eating a specific, let's say, genus or even species of plant. So they're very host specific. That's not always the case, but anymore, in order for a plant to get approved for use, they're really careful. And in some ways, they're not really introducing new insects anymore. But how does biocontrol work? Well, there's different theories about why some exotic plants are so successful. obviously there's a niche because there's a disturbance. So a weedy kind of plant, a plant that's good at showing up with the most first, is going to do well. Plant that produces a lot of seeds, or an annual, something like that. But there's something about certain non-native plants that makes them even more successful, almost super plants. People talk about it like that. But there's different theories about why. There's this thing called the enemy escape theory, and then there's other theories that they haven't quite, the ecologists and botanists and researchers are still trying to figure that out. But there is some reason why these plants are so successful, and some of it has to do with, no doubt, that they show up here without the insects to eat them. It's that simple. Is biocontrol effective? You guys probably know, you guys know St. John's wort? It's not so bad around here. It's bad in western Montana. And it's been around for a long time, and it's in some ways spreading. You're starting to see it in more places. It's spreading pretty slow in Montana. But back in the early part of the 1900s, it started to become really widespread in California on the west coast, in the rangelands of Northern California, Central California, Oregon. And it occupied millions of acres of rangeland that had been overgrazed. And so in the 1940s, they introduced Klamath weed, or they introduced these beetles that eat St. John's wort. Klamath weed, they call it, because it was really bad in the Klamath in California. But it was incredibly effective. And now St. John's wort's occupies 1% of the range that it used to occupy in California, and they were so pleased about it that I don't have that slide anymore. I was trying to find it, but there's a statue of this beetle in Arcata, I think, and it's because those ranchers were really psyched. It saved them tons of money. But the interesting thing is it's not as effective in Montana for some things having to do with climate. We don't have the right rainfall, but biocontrol safe. Well, so 38 insect species on 10 plant species are approved for use in Montana, and they all appear to be safe so far. They haven't switched hosts. They don't seem to have to damage native plants at all. But there are insects here that do pose a threat to native plants. So I think this is what it's still called, Cardus nutans or nutans, musk thistle. It's a biennial thistle that's not as common as it was in Montana, but it used to be really bad in rage. And people sometimes will tell me, they're like, oh, there's some musk thistle, it's getting pretty bad. And I'm like, are you kidding me? It's getting bad. You should have seen it back in the 80s. You know, that it always dates me. It's like, I feel old, but it's like, they introduced, one of the earlier biocontrol releases in Montana was this cute little weevil called Rhinocilus conicus. And it's a seed head weevil, and they weren't real careful about introducing it. It is a thistle weevil. It doesn't eat anything but thistle, but it likes a lot of thistles in about 3 genera, including the native Montana biennial thistles. And I think it actually, and it also to some degree will eat the perennial thistles, but it's incredibly effective on musk thistle. So effective that musk thistle is no longer on the noxious weed list. It's only like one of 2 plants that has been removed from the Montana noxious weed list over the years. The other one was Russian thistle, salsala, you know, that tumbleweed. For some reason, that was the first weed ever listed by Montana back in 1895, but then they realized it's not really a problem except in fallow wheat fields, so they took it off the list. But anyway, this guy showed up. This is what it does to a seed head of musk thistle. These are the larvae, and it eats the seeds, and it just decimates the seed heads. Problem is, it likes the native thistles. So they're, not that they've done any research or monitoring, but it does pose a threat to native thistle, including some rare, I think some thistle that are listed as threatened and endangered or sensitive in New Mexico and other places, like maybe the, can't remember, but there's a bunch of rare, there's a lot of native biennial thistles in the United States, and this loves to, it doesn't care, it eats them all. But what we're going to talk about mainly for Mount Haggin is Leafy Spurge. Are you guys familiar with that? So Leafy Spurge, although it's hard to get any exact numbers, the infestation acreage in Montana probably peaked at the early part of the 2000s. It's definitely on the decline in Montana, although most people don't realize that. But there's way less Leafy Spurge than there used to be. And it's because of these Leafy Spurge biocontrol insects. Have you guys ever seen any of these? These are the flea beetles, and then this is a stem-boring longhorn beetle, Oberea. And primarily it's this little flea beetle that has proven so effective. This is a root. So Leafy Spurge is a perennial plant that has a lot of rhizomes, and the rhizomes like to spread the A horizon of the soil. And so in an area with good soil development, Leafy Spurge can get really dense and spread, and that's when these little buggers there's the Oberea. Yeah. So these are the flea beetles. They when they are having an outbreak, when the flea beetles, after a couple years in a nice dense infestation where there's good soil, these flea beetles will reach a population density where it's an outbreak almost. They'll eat themselves out of house and home. So they lay eggs in the middle of the summer, and the larvae develop in the roots into the late summer and fall. And then they overwinter as larvae, and in the spring they wake up, and then they start eating the roots again, and then they'll pupate, and they'll just come boiling out of the soil as adults. And when there's an outbreak, there'll be so many of them. And as adults, they'll eat a little bit of the plant. They'll suck some of the juice out of the plant, but that's not the primary mode of control. The primary mode of control is the larvae eating the roots. So that year, when there's a ton of larvae down in the soil, less shoots of the Leafy Spurge will come up, and what few shoots do come up will get completely covered by the adults, and it will look like this. You'll just see black. And that's when you know that's the time to collect. And so there's a field that was pure Leafy Spurge, which is now, do you know what grass it is? So the field came back grass.
Isn't it slender wheatgrass or some kind of a wheatgrass?
Yeah, but so there's just a few stems left. This is the final year where there was any spurge in this area. There was just a few stems left, completely covered with beetles. They have nowhere to go, so these guys probably didn't survive. They didn't have anywhere to lay their eggs. There wasn't any spurge left. But so in 2004, I got a job to map a part of Mount Haggin, which is part of the Anaconda Uplands Injured Area. And so this is Mill Creek right here, and these are some of those gulches like Cabbage Gulch. You guys would probably go up there shooting up Cabbage Gulch or Joyner and some of these other. Here's the Continental Divide right up here. And all of these are those disturbed bare areas. But anyway, so I mapped weeds, and there was a lot of Leafy Spurge. You can see these are all big infestations of Leafy Spurge. These are little infestations. And then you can see this pink is Knapweed, and there's some Thistle, the green, and some other stuff. But mainly it was Leafy Spurge and spotted Knapweed. Now the problem is, when a mapping project for weed, you always have problems with scale and precision and accuracy. You look at that map, you're like, oh my God, it's so bad. But in this area, I mean, what's the precision? Like, did I get all the weeds? Was I accurate with the mapping? What's the scale? Like, is that line in the right spot? How wide is that line? There's all these problems with mapping that make it not all that objective. But basically, in general, this kind of shows you, this could be used as a control map to help people know where to target some control efforts, or to be used to into some ways at a landscape level gauge the effectiveness of your management program, because you could go back and map again and see how it's changed, at least at a landscape level. It wouldn't really tell you what was going on with specific infestations. I mean, there's no way you could find this spot at this scale. That you know, that might be a half an acre infestation, but that dot is probably 10 acres in size. But in general, this could be helpful, right? And then to show you, well, maybe I should go back to this. So the problem with this is that it's expensive and time consuming. So I did that in 2004 and they haven't paid me to go back since to redo it. So we don't really know how it's changed. I know that the spurge is gone. You can see it on Google Earth. I could get the Google Earth historical satellite imagery and you can see those infestations. Maybe not from that year, but from around that time. And then you could just keep progressing to now and you'd be like, wow, where's that spurge? It's gone, basically. But they don't know that. And so when I say they, I mean, like, let's say the Fish, Wildlife and Parks or the Damaged Lands Restoration Program or some of these other government agencies that are in control or that are involved in weed management or restoration up here. The problem is this stuff is expensive and time consuming and they never focus on that. What they focus on is control, spray, let's spray, spray, spray. So they don't really know how things changed. But this is what happened to the leafy spurge in portions of the Mount Haggin Wildlife Management Area. There's in 2003. This is up Willow Creek. There's a state section up Willow Creek, so if you go up that road a ways, you probably know that, and you go up, you know, like a quarter mile and you take a right, walk up a draw, and there's this south-facing hillside, and it was, when I first went up there, it looked like this. It was completely covered with leafy spurge. So we took photos, we put those black flea beetles out. I think we put 2,000 to 4,000 black flea beetles right there at that fence post. I went, looking further up, you can see there's just spurge all over the place. And there it is in 2005, and you can see there's that fence post. You see that how there, see how it's kind of going away? There's 2006, taken a little bit later. You can still see there's a little bit of spurge here. Actually, this was taken about the same time of year. 2007, there's some spurge down low in the shadier, wetter areas, but you look up here, there's a little bit right there. Maybe a little right there and there. Bad photo, I apologize. But do you notice something else about this photo? Do you know what this stuff is? That pink? What? That's knapweed. So I was all proud of myself. I'm like, yeah, we are kicking some ass now. And then you go up there and you're like, oh my God. And the weird thing is, there was knapweed all up Willow Creek. It was a problem up there. The whole area was disturbed. The only thing growing in a lot of places was spotted knapweed, but not up here. It was weird. Just around the corner, there was plenty of knapweed. And you never think about that. It's just like when you spray, you never think about, you're supposed to, all the guidelines tell you, don't spray unless you know what you want to have grow there instead. Don't do any weed management without thinking about what you would prefer to have grow there. Is there seeds there? Are you going to do revegetation? Should you spray if what's going to come in is worse than what you're spraying or putting bugs on it, turns out. The interesting thing about this biocontrol, it was so bloody effective. Right up here, you see this stuff, it's like dead spurge. It was so effective that usually it takes a while, and as the plants get controlled, it takes a few years. Something else will be growing there. There won't just be bare ground. I had never seen that before. You know, I had worked in areas that were much more, that had a lot better seed bank or that weren't as disturbed, and the weeds go away and other plants come in. Here, you would have these disturbance areas of just bare ground and dead spurge. And it was as if it had been sprayed, but it was from bugs. It was really, really odd. And so you ended up with that. And then I went back, you know, I've been going back ever since. God, that's a horrible, is there any way to focus that? I guess it doesn't really matter, but.
We can turn lights off.
Oh, but anyway, now this hillside is completely spotted knapweed, and we've been putting bugs, so there's really effective bugs on spotted knapweed that I'll get to in a second. And they're there, they're just taking a long time to have any impact. And I'm worried, I'm like, well, what happens when these knapweed bugs work? Hopefully native plants are at least more desirable, or at least a more diverse habitat will come in on its own, because the area, in areas around here, there's a lot of native plants. But anyway, in 2016 I saw this, and I thought I had, but they're going to go try to, it's a really small infestation, they're going to try to spray it. But do you guys know what that is? It's it's another yellow noxious weed. It's actually, I thought it was Dalmatian toadflax, and I started looking at it more carefully, and they would call it Dalmatian toadflax, but I think it's a weird hybrid of yellow and Dalmatian toadflax, because the leaves are much more narrow and the flowers are a little different. And I'm not that good at identifying the plants, but there's a number of biocontrol insects for the toadflaxes, the most effective of which is the stem-boring weevil, Maecenas janthinus. And there's strains of it that like yellow toadflax, but mainly it eats Dalmatian. And so I don't know what it will do. I forgot to bring samples of it, but this year I'm going to go get some samples of it and bring it to Robert and have him tell me what it is. But it's a toadflax. And so that shows up. So if, let's say, the biocontrol of the spotted knapweed really started to work, and they didn't spray that, that's what would be there next. So you'd see this progression. Biocontrol, oh great, it works so well. Big deal. What would end up happening is those biocontrol bugs, let's say they worked for the toadflax, you'd end up with another plant that there weren't any bugs for. Or if they sprayed, you would end up with a plant that was resistant to the spray. And it probably would be a monoculture, and it would probably be an exotic. And so basically what that tells you, regardless of the weed management activity that you're conducting, you might want to think about re-veg, or at least what would be better growing there. So spotted knapweed biocontrol. So spotted knapweed, interesting plant, shows up from Europe. And in Europe, Robert's seen it in Europe, we were just talking about it. It's just a pretty little wildflower that grows in grassland habitats, and not aggressive or successful by any means. And here it's a perennial that can live up to 9 years, huge seed production. In areas where it had been well established, if they prevented seed production, there'd still be 98,000 seeds per acre after 7 years, because there's a half-life. I think it has spotted knapweed seeds have like a 10-year half-life. That means after 10 years, half the seeds are still around. I don't know if it's somewhere in there. And this is a researcher from MSU back in the 90s. He's like, oh, that biocontrol is not going to work, because so far they have not been successful. Now though, even though we haven't been seeing control of spotted knapweed at a landscape level yet, the insects have changed the biology and the morphology of the spotted knapweed itself. So now spotted knapweed, if you were to try to go out and you were researching spotted knapweed and you wanted to learn about the biology and morphology, and you were getting your samples from out in the field where the biocontrol insects were established, and they are now, they're very ubiquitous, you would instead come up with a plant that, instead of being a perennial, would be a biennial. What's it called when a plant's a biennial but it can produce seeds both years? It's not like it dies once it flowers. Isn't there a word for that?
I'm not sure.
It's not one of those plants that as soon as it flowers it dies the second year, but it only lives 2 years, so it's a different kind of biennial. It produces not that many seeds, and it's much smaller, and it has a much less biomass than it used to. So it's a different plant, basically. This is what we're starting to see in western Montana around Missoula. You know, Missoula, they used to call spotted knapweed like the bitterroot alfalfa, you know, because that's like, you couldn't harvest hay in the bitterroot without it ending up being like half knapweed, you know? And this is what research is starting to show, that you get the bugs introduced, and then after maybe 8 years, you start to see a decline in the spotted knapweed canopy cover and density. So this is in areas where this is not what's happening up on Haggin, however. This is where it's actually working. So these are the seed head weevils. You guys, if you start looking at old seed heads, like you could see that right now, you'll see this hole where the larva came out. That's an emergence hole of this guy. It looks a lot like that Musk thistle weevil, but it's different. And then this guy is the root weevil that's really successful. That's a big weevil, you know, but now they're a lot smaller because knapweed's a lot smaller. This is when knapweed was big and robust, and now these weevils are a lot smaller, but they're still really effective. That's the larva of that root weevil, of the Siphochleonis acades. So if you guys were out in the field and you were wondering if it wasn't the right time of year to see that weevil, you could pull a root, split it open. It would look like Swiss cheese if it had these. You could split it open. I wanted to mention one other thing though. Sorry, this just occurred to me. It's kind of out of context, but I was driving up to Mount Haggin with Robert and one of his graduate students and some other people last year. And one of his graduate students looked out the window and was like, oh, look, there's Leafy Spurge right there. It looks like it's starting to move in to the area. And I was like, yeah, looks like it's actually leaving to me. You know, it's like, there it was, and that's a snapshot in time. And, you know, so from like the human perspective, you know, people are always like, oh, that's an invader, Leafy Spurge. It's on the way, it's on the move, it's taking over. But I just happened, it was in a spot that it was up by Fairmont along the interstate, you know, and I'd seen that spot just visually decrease over the years. And so the thing with noxious weeds is it's really like, whoa, yellow flower, it's taken over, it's like a slow moving wildfire. And it's like, well, in nice native habitat, it's such a slow moving wildfire, it doesn't really move, you know, but in disturbed areas, it can be kind of like a wildfire, but it could be one that's going the other direction too. It could be on the decline, like a lot of these. Anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but I was supposed to discuss. So this is what, oh God dang it. Oh yeah, so this is how effective spotted knapweed biocontrol can be, and this is what we're hoping to see up on Mount Haggin soon. And I'm just starting to see the preliminary signs of control up there, but this will be something that we'll hopefully be able to monitor and map over the next few years. But this is Drouillard fishing access site on the Jefferson, and this is probably the first place in the country that root weevil really was successful, because this is one of the first spots in the country where they put that root weevil. So this is when I was working for the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and they had put this bug out here in this whole area that they, you know, like Haggin, the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks gets great deals on property, you know, and they buy these property, and it's like the people are like, well, we better just graze the piss out of that place before we sell it to the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So the place was just completely grazed to the ground, I think by sheep. And then it got completely covered by spotted knapweed, and then the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks got it. And then everyone's bitching at the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, you gotta control your weed. So luckily they put up signs, and somehow they managed somehow they kept the sprayers out of there for a long time. I don't know how. I don't know if they'd be able to do something like that now, because it's right. You know, you pull into that fishing access site, and there was the insectary, And people, like, while I was there, people would call up my boss, you gotta spray, that knapweed's gonna spread everywhere. It's like, well, have you ever walked along the Jefferson? I think it has spread everywhere. But now, it looks like that. Actually, this is taken, I think, in 2001. I should have had a date on there. But it was incredibly effective, but it took a long time. It took like, I guess this is 2006, so it took 10 years or more, and every year that knapweed would be there. And then all of a sudden, one year, the knapweed was just dead. And it already declined a little bit, but if, when you're looking, when there's a spotted knapweed infestation, and there's no hillside, if it's just flat, and you're looking through the plants, it looks dense, even though the density might have been declining over time. You know how it is. And you might not even notice the plant's there until it flowers, so all you see is a bunch of pink, and it looks like it's just doing just as well year after year after year, but really for 2 or 3 years it had been in decline, and then all of a sudden one year it was all dead. And it was really, it came, although this is not native, I think this is smooth brome or whatever, but it came back with a lot of native grasses and wildflowers. It's beautiful fishing access site right now with a ton of needle and thread and all this other stuff. I guess that's, see, I always speak too fast, so.
No, that's perfect.
But you guys must have some questions about this.
Thank you so much first.
Yep.